episode 31. I am Wyatt Birkenoff, Art of Breakdown with WB, and I'm joined today with my co-host.
Yeah, I'm Anawiltus. Very happy to be here.
Yes, of course. And today is going to be a discussion over the Communist Manifesto, Chapter 1, and I'm sure we're going to be discussing general ideas about the Communist Manifesto as well, but we decided to focus on just the first chapter because we thought discussing the whole book would be a little bit too much of an episode. So we will be discussing just this first
Yep.
chapter.
Yeah. Full disclosure here. I'm not a Marxist. Just so you know, that's my background. How about you?
I'm not either. No, I mean, yeah, no, I didn't even really. Okay, let's put it
I,
this way.
I mean,
Let's put it this way, right? So you know how you always have the whole debate, or the whole, I guess you could call it a debate, where it's like as soon as you get into college, they're going to socialize you and make you a liberal or whatever it is. Which is, for me, luckily not really necessarily been the case. Now the reason I bring that up is, at first I didn't really care to know what Marxists believed, because I didn't, just from what I've heard about it, it it's a flawed system. So I'm like, why would I want to invest time in it if it is flawed? But anyway, long story short, is I've kind of gained some interest to see what the system is, to know why it's flawed, and doing the chapter here is also bringing up some beliefs that they had. But anyway, that's a long way of saying that at first I just ignored them and didn't really even know what they stood for. But now I know a little bit and still wouldn't necessarily say that I'm a Marxist by any means.
yeah. But I think one thing that's very important to note, especially since we're talking about the first chapter, is that it's not so much, especially in the first chapter, it's not so much a proposal of a system as it is a an exposition of what is wrong in today's society, and of course in the 1800s, what is wrong in today's society. So I think that there are some genuine concerns, although as other people have said, I don't necessarily agree with certain analytical points that are made here and there. But I do think that there are some general concerns, and of course, a lot of people do find Marxism interesting because it seeks to address those certain concerns that arose in those days, and that people can then reinterpret to today's concerns as well. So I'm going to say that there are genuine concerns that I think existed among Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels back in the day, that I don't think we should just simply reject out of hand as meaningless.
Right, for sure. Like you mentioned, many of the theories that he starts with in chapter one is kind of, I don't necessarily want to use the word generic, but is kind of starting the building blocks in a way for what he later argues for. And those building blocks are still very much what people believe now, I would say, of having, class structures in politics and things like that. It's still stuff that people very much believe exist. So in that way, it definitely makes sense to why people might latch on to his starting arguments and then could go further from there.
Yes, and I think a huge root of this, as is seen in both this document and a document that came out a few months before the uh, Communist Confession of Faith, it's called, written by Engels, which defines a number of terms that are later on being used in the Communist Manifesto and talks about a number of different issues. I think that Marxism and its successive branches arose partially due to economic hardship that occurred in a lot of areas and economic upheaval from the Industrial Revolution. And this is, of course, the Industrial Revolution is a hugely transformative period in history that really changed social structure, how people were organized, the lives of the average person, what it was like, and also how wealth was distributed, and therefore how social classes existed. And this upheaval produced a bit of an instability in this successive society that, of course, it ironed out some of its problems, but of course new problems emerge and society goes on. There's always some problem. And these problems that emerged due to the Industrial Revolution and its consequences led to the development of new ideologies such as Marxism and communism, but also we can see this focus on the Industrial Revolution even in more recent writers like Ted Kaczynski, for example, who focuses very heavily on the Industrial Revolution as something that's very transformative.
That was going to be kind of one of my questions that I was going to ask to kind of start this, but the whole question idea I had was most of these, because would you call this a political theory? I guess we could start with that. Would you say that this is a political theory? Not so much maybe in the first
well,
chapter.
I would say it's more. I would say it's more than a political theory. It is a theory of history, of anthropology. It is a theory of sociology. So it's more than simply, let's say, a legalist walks into a room and says, "What are the problems this country is having, and what laws do we make to solve them?" No, what it is a theory that seeks to explain many problems throughout history and seeks to bring in a final solution, perhaps not to every single problem, but a solution that is sufficient to end a binary struggle that is perceived to have occurred repeatedly throughout history.
Right. And then the second part of that was the whole idea that most of the time, now you say it's more than a political theory, but just to make things easy for what I'm saying, if it is just a political theory, right, most of these political theories come up because of the time it's in, like what struggles are existing in that period of time, and then you can kind of see why they think that way. And you can point to a lot of political ideas or political theories and say, oh yeah, it came kind of from this period of time. And you kind of already talked about the industrial side to that, so you kind of already answered that question. And I would say that I generally tend to agree with it, but I do think that a lot of the really solid political theories or political ideas can go across that particular time period and still become relevant in whatever economic class you're in now, or how the economics look in today's period.
Yeah, and of course, it's also important to, yeah, you mentioned economics. Economics is a very huge element to Marxism. And also, I would say another influence is the philosophy of Hegel. So Hegel was a German philosopher who lived slightly before Marx, who ended up bringing out a lot of ideas and is considered important in German idealism, a philosophical school that emerged in Germany in the 1800s and the late 1700s to some extent, if you look at different influences and how it's going. And so Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels were together in a club of people in Berlin that discussed the ideas of Hegel and other ideas, and they didn't all agree on different points. So they're actually very diverse in the directions that they take Hegel's ideas. But you end up, for example, with Max Stirner, for example. That's another famous philosopher here who is famous for his egoism, where he's not only interested in getting rid of, let's say, the government and being an anarchist in that sense, but he also wants to get rid of all different authorities so that everybody can live for themselves in an egoist, a self-centered, self-expressive, you could say, lifestyle. Now, of course, I'm not an expert on Hegel or on Stirner, so I'm not going to go into that today. But it is worth noting that Marx and Engels didn't live in a vacuum. They had a number of other people they interacted with, and they moved around different places in Europe. So when the Communist Manifesto was being written, that they were in London at the time, and of course, as it says, it was written in multiple different languages to be disseminated in different places in Europe.
Right. I'm trying to think how to word this question best, but personally, I think when they were writing this book or writing this, whatever you necessarily want to, the Communist Manifesto, when they were writing this, to me, it appeared that they were focused on the period of time that was existing now and the history of how it may have got there or how they think it got there. But it also seemed to be focused on trying to make a idea that could exist in the future. I think that they were very focused on creating a concept more than just a time capsule of an event.
Yeah. I think one thing that's very important to note is that an important element of Marxism is the idea of materialism, and that therefore history and the past, and therefore also the future, can be analyzed in a way that uses reason, and theoretically you could use the scientific method. Now, of course, there's different approaches to studying history, and that material elements of society and history are the ones that are most important, and things that are considered immaterial by cultures are merely symptoms of something else that is happening materially. So in that sense, it lends itself very much to an atheistic outlook, and Marxism has by some been described as a religion. And of course, in certain areas where people have attempted to implement Marxism or other more comprehensive ideologies, as you could call them, they do take on the form of a religion in that they have their own presuppositions, their own values, and their own truth claims, and also a hope for a brighter future and a method for achieving this brighter future, a method for achieving the salvation of the proletariat from their repeated cycle of oppression. So in that sense, people have compared it to a religion, and I don't think that it is an inappropriate comparison to make if we decide that what defines a religion is not necessarily a supernatural element, but a more broad definition, as I had used in a previous episode, of more of a values system.
Right. I've definitely heard those. I definitely have heard those ideas before when discussing the Communist Manifesto, or how they came in how they came in to writing it, or their ideas based off of it. Now, when you get into the chapter, the first chapter, obviously, as we've already mentioned, it's kind of a building blocks more than necessarily like their exact political theory, or I just call it political theory to make it easy, but their whole idea, right? And one of the concepts, I guess, one of the concepts is discussing structure of how classes work. Usually, classes in the sense of how people fit into them economically. What do you think about that whole idea?
Well, the idea is ultimately that, and I think one thing that's very important to note is that some people take an idea out of proportion because the class system is described as binary. Some people take this as an oversimplification of the historical multi-class systems that exist in many societies. But I think it's important to note that based on the analysis and based on the previous document that I mentioned, the Communist Confession of Faith, it is worth noting that Marx and Engels don't believe that there exist purely binary class systems in that sense. They acknowledge that there can exist multiple classes at the same time that take different elements. What they do posit, however, is that the majority of cases and that there is a tendency for a binary divide to exist, and that the other classes that might exist in a society would therefore be either very minor classes or classes that are allied with either the oppressor or the oppressed in that system, forming perhaps a broader base in that sense. So I think one criticism put against the analysis that it is too reductionist in the class system can be pulled away from by understanding that they understood the existence of multiple classes in a society at the same time, but more than two. But nevertheless, I do still think that it is somewhat reductionist in its approach to class dynamics, especially in a statement as it goes into it. But should we take a little read of it?
Yes, of course.
If you like. Yeah. I think it's appropriate here that I read the preface or introduction that is on the text. I'll read it in the original German just for the sake of the video, because I did read the Communist Manifesto in both English and German, and then I also listened to it in audiobook in both forms, and then I took a number of different critiques, both from a Marxist and non-Marxist perspective, socialist and non-socialist perspectives, so that I have a very rounded out understanding of it. But anyway, here we go. Ein Gespenst geht in Europa, das Gespenst des Kommunismus. Alle Mächte des alten Europa haben sich zu einer heiligen Hetzjagd gegen dies Gespenst verbündet. Der Papst und der Zar Metternich und Guizot, französische Radikale und deutsche Polizisten. Wo ist die Oppositionspartei, die nicht von ihren regierenden Gegnern als kommunistisch verschrien worden wäre? Wo die Oppositionspartei, die den fortgeschrittenen Oppositionsleuten sowohl wie ihre reaktionären Gegnern den brandmarkenden Vorwurf des Kommunismus nicht zurückgeschleudert hätte? Zweierlei geht aus dieser Tatsache hervor. Der Kommunismus wird bereits von allen europäischen Mächten als eine Macht anerkannt. Es ist hohe Zeit, dass die Kommunisten ihre Anschauungsweise, ihre Zwecke, ihre Tendenzen vor der ganzen Welt offen darlegen und dem Märchen vom Gespenst des Kommunismus ein Manifest der Partei selbst entgegenstellen. Zu diesem Zweck haben sich Kommunisten der verschiedensten Nationalität in London versammelt und das ganze folgende Manifest entworfen, das in englischer, französischer, deutscher, italienischer, flämischer und dänischer Sprache veröffentlicht wird. And so that's the famous words, very iconic. The basic introduction of it, there's a specter in Europe, and that's communism. And all the different political establishments in Europe have allied themselves together against communism. And now even the political parties are accusing each other of being communists because of how bad communism is. And so in response to this, Marx and Engels believe that it is time for communists to reveal what their views are, their purposes, their tendencies to the whole world, so that communism actually lives up to the fear that the establishment has of it. And so for this reason, they gathered together in London and wrote a manifesto in multiple languages that they then put forward. And so the next sentence, I'm not going to go anymore in German after this, because this is an English language program. But the next sentence of a manifest of the Communist Party, which is, I think, a central premise here, is Die Geschichte aller bisherigen Gesellschaft ist die Geschichte von Klassenkämpfen. So the history of all hitherto society is a history of class conflict. And that those are very famous words. They might not be translated exactly the same way by everyone. But I decided to read it in the original German just for full context of it. Since German is my first language anyway, so it's not a problem. But anyway, this is a central premise that is extremely important in understanding the Communist Manifesto and in establishing other elements to it. So the question is it true, and this is a question that somebody who's reading critically should ask themselves, is it true that the history of all society is a history of class conflict? Now, of course, as the first chapter moves on, they actually get into describing how this conflict works, and they don't get too much into all the past of it as they do in some other documents. But I think that whenever somebody's reading it, this first premise is very central to the first chapter and is also central to understanding the communist idea and how they perceive their problems and how they want to solve their problems.
Right. And I think you can, not to sidetrack too much off of the Communist Manifesto itself, but I think you can see some of those ideas being used in some socialists now. The idea being that if we fix the class structure, if we fix the way classes work with each other, and just the idea of it in general, things will be better for everybody if we work together. You know, that whole idea about everyone being united and not separate. So you could still very much see this idea with a lot of modern day socialists that I think are taking that idea from the Communist Manifesto in a large way. So I do think that, and to answer your question, do you mind restating your question again?
The question is this idea that the history of all society up to this point, or at least up to the 1840s when this was written, is the history of class conflict?
Right. That's a tricky question necessarily because I tend to bring it back and think of modern examples just so I can kind of fit my head into kind of what's going on now, so then I can go back and try to understand it back then, if that makes any sense. But
Yep.
like today, I still see a lot of people bringing it back to the idea that it does pretty much all of our political issues come from us being different and come from us being, you could take it, the difference as being as simple as a different color, or you could go to what a lot of people think of different economic classes, and until we fix that, like I was saying, like a lot of socialists believe, our problems will still exist. So in a large part, I think a lot
But
of,
I think
oh no, go on. Hmm?
I think the intersectional idea today is actually a lot different from the Marxist idea.
Hmm.
And that is because the Marxist idea does, even though it acknowledges that there could be multiple classes, it does still seek to reduce it to a binary conflict. And this is very different from the intersectional system, which seeks to define oppression rather than as a binary idea, instead as an idea of multiple categories where someone can be impressed in multiple different ways as being a member of multiple different classes simultaneously, uh, or also simultaneously be the oppressor in the form of being in another class. And this seems very different from the Marxist idea, especially since the intersectional idea focuses a little bit less on actual economic prosperity and employership, or being a bourgeois person. It focuses on a more individualist sentiment, even, interestingly enough, especially when you get into questions of today's feminism and related movements. The LGBT movement is surprisingly individualistic in a number of different ways compared to Marxism, wherein identity is determined by the individual who is identifying himself. And I use him in a neutral sense, of course.
Right.
Although that's apparently not as grammatically favored as it used to be. I just want to make it very clear,
Have to be careful.
because I could say himself or herself. I'm just going to say himself because that's how it is. Don't mean to disparage women. It's just grammar. But anyway,
Yeah.
uh, getting back to it, I do think, therefore, and I think it's accurate when people say that a lot of people today, even in BLM, where some of its leaders famously said that they were trained Marxists, I don't think that they are Marxists in the same way that Karl Marx was. And I think that that's very true even to Marxists today, where there's different branches. There's revisionism of Marxism. There's non-orthodox versions of Marxism. There's various split off groups where there's even people that argue on whether or not Marxism was in favor of a centralized state control or in favor of anarchism. So there's actually people that consider themselves orthodox Marxists who don't believe in anarchy as something that they should be striving for, which is interesting because that's commonly not the herd narrative. Now, of course, this is based on different interpretations of Marxist literature, of the literature of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, although it is also worth noting that there's an understanding in Marxist literature that because it is an ongoing materialist analysis, that people in the future might come to slightly different conclusions than they themselves came to. So,
Right.
in that sense, what I'm saying is that there's a somewhat disconnect in the priorities that people have today and in those that they had back then.
Right, right. I think it's also fair to say that when something like this gets made in its original process of it being made, it's very pure between the people who are making this. And the people that are eventually going to read it are getting the first hand of this information. So, of course, they can come up with their ideas and argue back against it or go like, yeah, I agree with everything that is said in here. You know, you're going to have both perspectives, both of the sides. But the more this book gets passed on, the more the idea can change. So the theory that people now think the Communist Manifesto is, or Marxism is, could be entirely different than what it was just, 20 years ago, because people could keep changing it to fit what they think makes it look better. I think that's also fair to say with something like this as well. And
Yeah, and this is also how people that, based on the class analysis of Marx and Engels, uh, would be described as being bourgeois, end up sometimes supporting movements that might self-describe as Marxist, but that aren't Marxist in the same way as Karl Marx was. Uh, so that's interesting.
right. That's what one of the chatters here brought up. He said that Leninism wasn't a Marxist in the same way Marx was. So that's kind of just what you just said there. There's obviously different shades of what Marxism or communism as an idea would be. Of course. There's when it comes to politics, there's never just one idea. We always need to know that.
Yeah. Now getting back to this idea of this historical binary, an important question is, how can we see this happening in the past? So one thing that's described is the I I don't think they're referred to as such in the book here, but the liberals in the French Revolution and the American Revolution, who had a more bourgeois background as opposed to the old feudal lord class coming into dominance in the 1700s, in the English Civil War, the bourgeois rising up. So that's sort of seen as part of this expression of a class conflict, where the bourgeois with more liberal values and free trade come to dominance, and they use the effectiveness of capitalist production to gain dominance, not only in the countries in which they are, but also in other countries. It talks about the Chinese wall being battered down by the production that the capitalists have. And I think that that's something that's worth noting, is that Karl Marx doesn't actually say that capitalism is materially inefficient in that sense. I think he does talk about the extreme economic success of the capitalist system. So his objections to capitalism are not so much based on the theory of overall economic prosperity, as much as they are based on objections to the oppression of the lower classes and the change that this new industrial bourgeois capitalist society has brought to the majority of people in a society. Now, that being said, what are these changes? Well, a lot of people used to be agrarian, but as the Industrial Revolution rolled around, simultaneously there was the enclosure movement in the countryside, where noblemen decided to privatize their formerly feudal estates, and that meant that people that used to work on the public or shared common land, because many feudal estates had an area that was a common land that was eventually privatized in this time period. Um, and so a lot of people, those who were not employed by the agricultural landowners, ended up having to move somewhere else, and a lot of them moved into the city as the Industrial Revolution was happening, and therefore they ended up becoming factory workers. And another thing the Industrial Revolution did that is objected to is how, let's say, for example, weaving. There are industrial weaving machines that are capable of weaving much faster than a small-time hand operated workshop can weave. And therefore, they outcompete these small-time self-employed people that used to live in each town, or at least each town in an area. There used to be people that did this kind of stuff. And now it's all concentrated in urban centers, in the factories. And these small-time weavers don't exist anymore because they can't compete in the market. And therefore, the urban industrialists gain a huge market share and also a huge share of employees, and therefore a much greater control of the industry. Right. And this is something that is objected to by Karl Marx. And as this happens, of course, there's the objection that underemployment, based on a labor theory of value, which a lot of economists object to, but based on a labor theory of value, the work put into an item, it can be equated to the value of an item that is produced, and that therefore the proceeds from an item should be divided. The proceeds from a sale should be divided based on the amount of work that was put into the item. So the worker would gain a very large share. Maybe the people who are responsible for the machines gain a small share, and then the actual manager of a factory would gain an even smaller share under this theory, because he's not actively working hard in the same way that the worker is.
Right.
But the manager actually gets paid more, and the worker is paid less, and this is considered to be a bit of an injustice. Now, of course, it is worth noting that a counter-argument made is that the people did indeed agree to work for a particular wage, and that therefore they are doing this voluntarily. Now, of course, another argument that the Marxists would make is that in a capitalist society, it is not possible to opt out of being someone who is a worker in such a way, and that therefore it is essentially, in a way, instead of being a slave that's the property of a particular person, the proletarians are the collective property of the bourgeoisie as a class, because the proletarians are unable to compete independently and also unable to operate economically outside of the wage labor system.
Right.
And this is viewed as an injustice in some ways. So these are objections that are being made by Karl Marx. Now, of course, later on, we do see a development of increased social mobility in a lot of societies. So, arguably, this isn't so much of a problem nowadays, especially nowadays when we see the rise of a gig economy. So, with information technology and a market for skills and commodities being different, we see a situation where the rise of small-time independent workers is that's actually coming back in some ways through the process of a gig economy. But we've yet to see how that will develop. But I do think it is worth noting that Marxists do consider this wage labor system to be unjust.
For sure, for sure. Um, and you brought up a lot of good points, and also points that if anybody follows modern day politics has probably heard before as well. They bring up a lot of the same examples you were talking about when discussing the theory there. But I just wanted to expand on one more thing, or at least get your perspective on this. So this may be too simplistic, but I think it's worth asking. So would a Marxist believe that a person who works for the company, a employee, should he make the same, or he or she, whatever, make the same amount of money as the boss of that company? Would they believe that the wages across an entire thing should be the same, or do they see that there should be some difference?
I don't think I think that that's an exaggeration a lot of people make. Now, of course, there are some socialists who do believe that everybody should get the same, but that's certainly not uh, a majority position as far as I'm aware. So they do think that people both should work. So they're not interested in people being free riders, essentially. But I don't think that they would object to people who work harder or do something that is particularly more contributive to the final result being paid more. I think the problem is the disproportionate amount that uh, people who are simply owners of something are being paid, especially in the long term after the startup period, when they might not be contributing any more startup capital as they might have at the beginning, um, especially later on. Let's say, for example, a good example would be if you own a large amount of stock and you gain dividends each month. Uh, that would be a very bourgeois status to be in, because all your the only reason you're gaining dividends is because you own a lot of stuff in that sense, and that's an objectionable thing to a Marxist.
Right.
Now, if you were perhaps actively involved in the process of a company, it might be a bit different. Um, but then they would argue that it shouldn't be based on how much you own, but more on what you're doing in the company. Uh, so that's a bit of a different perspective there.
Right. I also see a lot of debates when talking about Marxist and this approach. People are like, arguing for it in a way. They're like, well, think of it in this way. Capitalism does lead, to some goods because, people are able to go from poor to rich or be able to support their families through, operating their own business. Several examples you could bring up when it comes to capitalism the way it exists now in America, right? But they always bring up, well, there's still many issues, and that's why the poor can't become rich because of capitalism. Is a common argument you hear. And long story short, on what ultimately they end up saying is a Marxist economy or a Marxist approach, although it would take a lot of work to get to, is what America should be. It should be more for everybody and not just the people that have the motivations maybe to work and grind all the way to become a CEO. And those people are the only ones that are rich in today's economy. So it should be more, we should be taking a more global approach for our economy.
Um, I think that that's too recent
Too
a
recent, yeah.
perspective. I don't know how well that would translate into the actual ideas of Karl Marx.
Right.
Uh, because one thing I noticed, because I talked about the rise of factory workers and such things. Now, it is worth noting that in today's economy in the United States, for example, um, a surprisingly large proportion of the population ends up at some point in their lives being high income or uh, high status in some way, and it seems to be more based on a generational flow where people sort of build themselves up as they go, and they might peak early, in the middle, or later in life. Uh, but what we see is that there's a highly fluid class dynamic, at least compared to uh, more ancient societies. But if we're actually extrapolating the class conflict back in time, what we see is what brought the end of the feudal lord, Feudalherren, as it is in German, and the serf dynamic. What we see is it wasn't actually a conflict between classes, but it was simply uh, economic pressures due to a population decline from the Black Death. We see that serfs simply became much wealthier because there were less people to hold wealth, and that led to the progressive emancipation of serfs in Western Europe in that time. Or we don't really hear about a conflict in Western European history leading to the end of slavery. What we see is that it's a more gradual thing as people were, for perhaps economic reasons and also for religious reasons, rolled into other social classes out of slavery. People were emancipated at some point, and what we see is that as European history goes on from the Roman times, we see the rise of serfs and the decline of slavery to the point where slavery is widely condemned in a lot of different places in medieval Europe. Then we see the rise again of slavery later on, but the collapse of slavery in the United States, which happened after the Communist Manifesto was written, so it's not really too applicative to the formation of his ideas. But it happened not so much due to any slave revolt or a class conflict in which the slaves were a particular class. Now, it is worth noting that the class conflict is, however, described as a majoritarian lower class against a minority ruling class. And so that is important to understand, that the focus on minorities that exists in intersectionality doesn't apply to this more classical conception of Marxism, where the oppressed class is considered to be the majority of people, as being the lower class in a society. So what I'm essentially saying is that the idea that Karl Marx puts forward in this chapter, that the resolution of this class conflict repeatedly happens through either mutual annihilation of the two sides or through a revolutionary reform, uh, that that doesn't to me that seems very questionable in history. Now, I can understand that there are places where you could argue something like this happened, but I certainly don't think it is normative. I don't think it is useful as a normative historiography. So I would also say that when we're talking about history, there's many conflicts that can't really be explained purely based on a class dynamic. There's a lot of horizontal class conflicts. And also in medieval Europe, for example, the idea of the serfs being an oppressed class wasn't really something that emerged until the modern times in a lot of sense, because in medieval Europe, societally and socially, there was this idea of a harmonious society that existed where people had different roles that they served, and serfs were important in their role, and the nobles in their role, and the clergy in their role, etc. And so, and there were some very wealthy serfs. There were even serfs that acquired noble titles, etc. And a lot of people tend to underplay the degree of social mobility that existed in the Middle Ages, partially because due to the prestige of having a good lineage, people would emphasize certain elements of their ancestry more than others. But I think it is worth noting that I don't think that Marx's analysis of history is accurate, at least based on my understanding of history. Now, I don't have a perfect understanding of history, but I do think that there's more available information today on early modern and pre-modern history than there was at the time of Karl Marx. Partially because of archaeology really taking off, and also because nowadays with information technology, it's not easier to look at ancient documents and to share information. So I think that Marx's idea of history is inaccurate, and academically speaking, outdated.
The serfs example is a really good one, but you could also bring up many, I guess you could say, counter examples to many of what he had used before, such as maybe like with the Egyptian period, where you had a bunch of peasants or slaves to make the pyramids. You had all these type of class structures there. Mayans, Incans, most of the ancient empires.
We know that.
No, go on.
We know that those slavery and chattel slavery did exist in Egypt. A lot of the building projects were done more through a system of serfdom or labor tax, as you could call it. So I think describing it as slavery is inaccurate, because both a form of serfdom and slavery existed in Egypt at the same time. So maintaining the distinction is important, but also it's important to understand that a lot of skilled workers were also involved in Egypt at those times.
Right.
But what I'm saying I'm not saying that there never was a class conflict anywhere, and that there never was something that could be reduced to a class problem. That's not what I'm saying. What I am saying is that this is normative. Well, even going beyond saying that it's normative, saying that it is the summation of all history is not justified. That's what I'm saying.
Right. No, I got that perspective. I was just trying to think of what his counter argument could be for certain types of cultures that had existed in history. But I mean, you could say that he may have cherry picked examples because he at the time he wrote this, he obviously had access to the medieval time. But as you also mentioned, he may not have known about the ability of serfs to move up because of that could have been found later than when he wrote. And I'm not 100% certain on that. But
Well, I'm sure a lot of stuff was available back then,
right.
and he was a well-read person. He spent a lot of time reading a number of different books.
Hmm.
But what I'm saying is, even if he is a well-read person, we simply have more stuff available to read nowadays,
Right.
and even stuff that wasn't available in his time that's older than his time. So we actually have, and I think this is true about a number of other fields of historical study, where we know more about ancient Egypt today than we did in 1800, or we know more about how ancient, for example, Bible manuscripts were transmitted, and we have more information available today on that than people had in the fifth century. Even you could say
Hmm.
uh, that we have a more complete understanding of certain things nowadays than we did even 100 years ago, and that's not because we got any smarter, I would say, but it's because we simply have access to more information due to archaeology, but also because we are able to share that information a lot more easily.
Right.
For example, there's thousands of cuneiform texts that are being translated, and you can read some of them online. And so I'm not disparaging Karl Marx for not having access to information. But I am saying that his analysis is inaccurate based on information that's available to me today.
Okay. If Karl Marx existed today and he was writing this manifesto now, with the information we have today and Google and all that comes with it, do you think he would come to the same conclusion? I know that's probably hard to answer, but do you think he would still believe what he wrote back then?
Um, I don't think he would, and that's partially because, as we had already said, a lot of movements that are based on Marxism have changed a lot since Karl Marx. Uh, so because of the way they have changed, any new movement that would emerge today would also have changed. It's an idea that uh, the spirit of the times, or the Zeitgeist, as people say in German, is something that you have to be there to think in that way, or you have to really understand a lot about that particular period in history to put yourself in the place of that period in history. For example, um, after World War One, that's another transformative era in history where a lot of things changed, where a lot of people became disillusioned with older ideas and developed newer ideas. For example, you see in Italy had a socialist party, but some members of a socialist party decided to develop national syndicalism that then became fascism, for example. Uh, and that's partially because of things that happened in World War One, or Germany, especially due to what happened after World War One in Germany. A lot of things changed, and that led to the rise of new political movements there. Um, so the spirit of the times helps produce the political movements, the cultural milieu that people are in, produces certain ways of thinking, and also looks at certain problems that exist at the time. So Karl Marx was living in a time where industrialism was relatively new. He talks about it as being about 100 years old. Um, just a century or almost a century, and this new system, therefore, is still in its adjustment phases, just as today we are adjusting to information technology. Back then, people were adjusting to industrialism. And so new problems emerged. And as we talked about in the video on the American parties, sometimes what happens is a problem emerges, a particular group emerges to deal with a problem, and then the mainstream absorbs an idea from that group, and then the group itself becomes redundant and falls away. So in that sense, a lot of movements throughout history have become redundant because elements of that movement have been absorbed by the mainstream. And we see this in history where people complained about about abuse of workers and unsafe conditions in workplaces, and then reforms were made and new parties emerged, and then existing parties changed their positions to new positions in order to deal with a problem. And that's why there's new labor laws in different places. So in that sense, I don't think that there would be any reason why the Communist Manifesto would be written the way it is if it were written today.
Right.
Now, that being said, even just a year after it was written, what we see is major revolutions throughout Europe. The revolutions of 1848 and 1849. And instead of being the big communist threat that everybody was worrying about, according to Marx and Engels, I'm not entirely sure how much of that opening idea was hype and how much people were actually having a Red Scare at the time. But what actually happened is nationalist revolutions. So as Metternich is mentioned in the introduction, Clemens von Metternich is was an Austrian diplomat and later on a prime minister that was very important in drafting the treaty at the end of the Napoleonic Wars and establishing a balance of power in Europe. And then the revolutions of 1848 and 1849 roll around, and he comes out of power. The government in Austria has to readjust. There's upheavals in Germany, in France, and in other places throughout Europe. And it's not because of the communists, interesting enough. So there was a much bigger threat to the establishment at the time than the communists, and that was the nationalists at the time, who wanted to have their own nations, who wanted to have more liberal reforms, who wanted to get rid of the old absolutism that had developed in a lot of European monarchies, and wanted to have an increased representation in the government. So they were liberal and national forces that hand in hand went in revolution throughout Europe. And this was sort of against the predictions of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels in some ways, because it wasn't the communists that were the ones that were the big threat at the time. Now, that being said, you could say, well, of course, there was another force. Maybe it's the bourgeois continuing their revolt against the older classes in perhaps less liberalized areas of Europe. So that's something you could say. But what we see is later on in the book, this idea of the overthrow of a bourgeois system is considered something that's inevitable. Uh, it's not considered something that is something that people have to actively strive to cause. It's considered to be just a natural outcome and a material outcome of material causes, something that will happen inevitably. But what we see nowadays is that this prediction about the future uh, hasn't really come true in two different major ways. In one, the major communist revolutions that were effective didn't really occur in the more industrialized countries, but actually occurred in the less industrialized countries like Russia and China, which at the time were not very industrial. They were starting to industrialize, but they weren't very industrial. So, for example, in Russia, that's why the biggest socialist party initially, when they had elections after the first stage of a revolution, the biggest socialist party was the Socialist Revolutionary Party, which was an agrarian socialist party that was different from Marxism, because there's many different kinds of socialism, and Marxism and the industrial age focus of Marxism is only one of them. And of course, the Bolsheviks eventually had their own revolution against the SRs, and they took over the Soviet Union. But what I'm saying is that that is an example of how, even though you would imagine, based on these ideas, that the more industrial societies would be the ones that would be closer to revolution, they were not the ones that ended up having those big revolutions. At the same time, nowadays, the second reason that this original idea is flawed, in my opinion, is because we don't really see the development of Marxism into its classical form nowadays. We see a differentiation of these ideas away from that original form. And that means that the particular concerns of Karl Marx and the particular results which they desired are no longer the concern of today's Marxists in many ways, and today's socialists in many ways. And that means that the particular predictions that they had about how society would evolve and what things were leading to doesn't seem to be accurate. And of course, once again, Karl Marx, with a material view, would probably acknowledge if something else were to be discovered that really would question the reliability of his theory, that it would need to be changed because it wouldn't no longer be accurate. Because he's trying to be realistic in some sense. But so the change in the dominant forms of socialism, and also the fact of the less industrial countries having communist revolutions, and the continued rise of and prosperity of liberal countries and nationalist countries and essentially non-communist countries, really puts into question, especially the happiness of people in those countries, puts into question the accuracy of the Marxist predictions.
Right. Now, I don't think that any real system like this will be 100% accurate. I don't think any theory book, idea like this would be 100% accurate, but if the root of what that argument is wrong, then you could definitely say that the idea is wrong off of it, for sure. Now, to answer my own question, I would generally say that I think he would probably still come to the idea that classes are something that needs to be fixed, but I don't necessarily know if he would argue it in the same way. It's hard to ultimately say, but I find it hard to believe that a modern day Marx would come to the same conclusion as back then, just because of wealth of information or whatever reason you want to give. I think theories like this are going to change over time, and even if you take the most pure
and of
perspective
course,
of it.
and of course, what I'm saying also makes sense, because if I don't think that his analysis of the past is accurate, then I don't think that the resulting predictions for the future would be accurate either. So,
Right.
based on simply the hard premises of the argument, that is questionable. So and as I mentioned before, I looked at different perspectives, both pro-Marxist and anti-Marxist, and one of the people I looked at was Jordan Peterson, and he had a criticism that the amount of errors per sentence are enormous. Now, I think that's of course a paraphrase, and I think also on his part an exaggeration, but I do agree that a lot of the points made are points that I wouldn't agree with offhand, and that I would be interested in analyzing more specifically. For example, the opening sentence that we had been talking about. But there's obviously other points that he makes throughout that can be questioned in a number of different ways. But nevertheless, it does show you the importance of critical reading skills. But I do think that a big idea here to take away from this is that if the premises of an argument are heavily flawed, then the conclusions have a possibility to be flawed as well. And because I questioned in the past, I can't really get on board with the future predictions either of this Marxist theory. So now, of course, an important understanding here is that the Manifesto of the Communist Party, or the Communist Manifesto, was not written as an academic work, so some points in it aren't meant to be scrutinized academically speaking. And I'm not scrutinizing them academically. I'm just taking them at face value and asking, did this happen? Or is this true? Or is this likely to be true? And I end up disagreeing in a lot of different places. But understanding that it's not an academic work, of course, still doesn't excuse the problems that are apparent in it. I think that doesn't mean that you can't criticize it for making a claim if that claim is indeed incorrect.
Right, for sure, yeah. You should be able to critique anything. But
And of course, the whole other dynamic that we haven't even touched is the question of what is the basis for this idea of for the ethical theory underlying this. Why is it wrong for people to be exploited, and based on what is this true? And I think that that's a question that anyone who's writing a theory of this, like this, especially one that isn't really appealing to a particular moral background, needs to be able to answer. And I'm not saying that he made a mistake by not talking about it in the Communist Manifesto, but I do think that it is something that any Marxist should be prepared to discuss. The moral foundations, the ethical foundations for the complaints that are being made are important to discuss.
right, right. That would be very true to identify the full, I guess, belief of the idea for sure. I would think that they would argue and say that no exploitation is necessary or valid, uh, but I can't necessarily say that for certain. That may be too much of a modern take of what Marxism is now, compared to what he was arguing back then. Because as we mentioned very early on in this episode, was he doesn't necessarily say that capitalism is 100% evil and needs to be stopped immediately. He does give some value to it, saying that it does lead to some good, but he says it ultimately has some bads, and that's kind of his starting thing. So because of that, I would think that maybe back then he would say that there are certain types that are useful to having a productive society, but that would be interesting to kind of to know what he would value there.
Yeah. Yeah, because getting onto the underlying value theory of something really helps you get down to the fundamental differences between that idea and other ideas. Uh, because obviously, a lot of people object to communism on religious grounds. And so, no matter what type of solution communists might propose, if you already disagree on the ethical framework of it, then you can't really come to an agreement. And that produces an interesting situation there.
Right, right. And I think that is a valid argument to take as well, to understand this. I do think that there is credence to that. Uh, yeah, I was gonna say that it's people who just take arguments in the time capsule that they were written in. I do think makes some sense. Like, for other words, when we discussed the founding fathers, right? We said, well, many of them had slaves themselves, and they took this perspective of having slaves, and it was these reasons why they did, even if they didn't necessarily support it fully, blah blah blah. And we were arguing in a time capsule of that part of history. And people in that episode, we discussed that people were saying that no, these founding fathers need to be, written out of history, or what, this is a drastic example, because they owned slaves. And we're like, well, that's a little bit crazy. But anyway, the reason I bring that up is I do think that arguing from a time capsule when something was written is important, but I also think we should have the ability to view things and look at it from outside of it as well. I think that both things are necessary to kind of understand the theory of what is being written here.
Okay. Yeah, I agree. I think it's important to be able to look at things from different perspectives, to be able to look at it from the internal contemporary perspective, the external contemporary perspective, and then perhaps a different future perspective, both internal and external, and perhaps even from a past perspective, internal or external. Because, for example, an important question about moral claims is, are these moral claims applicable in reverse to history? Could you go back in time and make a particular moral argument to someone that person, even if they might not agree, they might understand where it's coming from?
Mm-hmm. Right. I'm just thinking, like, the more perspectives you take, the better outcome you're gonna reach from it. And maybe, one perspective say, oh yeah, I can see, well, he had this theory, it makes sense. And then another perspective you go, well, maybe not. So I do think that there are shades to two things. But I definitely agree that if the history of something is wrong in the theory, and you're basing it off of the history, then ultimately your outcome is more than likely to be wrong as well.
Yeah, because it is supposed to be a coherent theory. And so if you find a problem and an element, you have to ask yourself, well, how does this apply to the rest of the theory? So if you look at Karl Marx's historical analysis and you say, maybe I don't think he was quite right about the idea of class conflict. I think that there's some stuff behind that and some real stuff that happened, but I don't think that it is as encompassing an idea as he says it is. Then the question becomes, well, if his mindset is that this is this encompassing idea, then how could his reasoning and the conclusions he makes from this be affected by that? And so that's where you end up with.
For sure. I think we could probably end with our conclusion here, unless you had any other question you wanted. Do you have any other questions, or?
I don't have any questions right now, but I would say, as a conclusion to what I think about it, I think it is an interesting read, certainly worth reading because of its influence. Now, I had read it a number of years ago before as well, and immediately from reading the first chapter, I immediately had similar ideas on the historical question as I do now. So I do think it is very flawed in its writing, and I understand why a lot of socialists nowadays tend to move more away from Marx's ideas because they don't hold up as much, both due to the changes in economy and also the changes in society and political changes and the outplaying of certain events in history. So that's my thoughts on it.
Right, and to conclude for myself, I think that many of the ideas being rooted in class we still see today in a lot of people's perspectives of politics, and that if the class structure's fixed, we'll become better as a whole society. So we still see a lot of those arguments. I don't necessarily think that I agree 100% with the idea of Marxism and what he was proposing in the chapter, but I still think it's worth reading to get just a perspective about it. You may not reach the same conclusions, but I think it is still worth reading.
Indeed.
And next week we'll be on Anavolta's channel for episode 32. But before we end this, if you do have any episode suggestions or just want to talk with us, we are available in our YouTube channels, our Discord servers, or wherever you might find us. And we're more than willing to potentially do a topic of your choice. So just if you have any ideas, definitely feel free to reach out to us there. But if you have anything to shout out, I'll give you that opportunity.
Yeah, if it's a longer type topic with a lot of heavy reading, we might have to wait some time before we tackle it, though.
Right.
But anyway, thank you all for watching, our beautiful audience. Karl Marx wrote and Friedrich Engels wrote the Communist Manifesto. I wrote Actionable Justice, which takes a very different approach, not really talking about economics, talking more about the concept of justice, probably in a way that's very different from a Marxist understanding. So maybe an interesting contrast.
Yes. And where can they find this book?
Well, you can find it. It's available online for Amazon Kindle, so you can look at it on Amazon. Or you can go to taurusnecrus.com, which is a bookstore to buy a physical copy.
Alrighty. Well, thank you everybody for stopping by, and anybody who may be watching in the future. We highly appreciate you, and see you next time on Anavolta